Good morning, everybody. I'm gonna, as usual, I'm gonna give this a couple minutes just to let everyone log on. It's gonna log on. Um, Hope everyone had a good weekend, and we're starting this week and then next week spring break. So I'm sure a lot of you are excited about that. If you are able to comment, I'd love to have some more feedback during the lesson today. Just some more comments on the side, questions, comments, interaction, just to make this more conversational than just a lecture. So if you're able to comment, if you have a channel, but if you don't have a channel, you can't necessarily comment, but you can shoot me an email. And if I see on my feed there the number of emails in my inbox go up, then I'll check to see if it's one from you. And if you have a comment or a question, I'll address that. So I'll give it about another minute, and then we'll get into the content today, which is the early civil rights movement. We're focused mostly on the 1950s, but we are going to talk a little bit about the very beginnings of the legal approach that the NAACP is going to use for the civil rights movement. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to cover. Give it 35 more seconds before we get into the content, just to give everyone a chance to log on. 20 more seconds. I love the countdown. I mean, I give the countdown sometimes when we do group notes and things like that, but I actually have a rolling countdown, so I don't necessarily have to keep track of it. It keeps track of it for me. All right, we're going to get into it now. So we're talking about the early civil rights movement in the United States. And just to keep the outline that your book gives in case you want to use your notes and go back over the material in the book, I'm going to start where the book starts. And just to give you an overview, the book's going to start with Rosa Parks, and it's going to go back in time, and then it's going to come back to Rosa Parks, and then go forward. So it's kind of an odd way they set it up, but I understand why they did what they did because Rosa Parks is one of the most iconic people in the civil rights movement next to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So in December of 1955, Rosa Parks gets on a bus, and busing was segregated at this point in time because of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896. The Supreme Court ruled then in 1896 that separate but equal was okay. So you could have separate accommodations for those who were black and separate accommodations for those who were white, as long as they were considered equal accommodations. So this doctrine, which is a bad doctrine, it's not good. It's a very poor decision by the Supreme Court. That's understating it. Very bad decision, Supreme Court allows for segregation, and the busing in the South was segregated because of Plessy versus Ferguson. They had a legal justification for segregation. So Rosa Parks is sitting on a bus, and the busing was set up in such a way that the front of the bus was for whites, the back of the bus was for those who were black, and the middle of the bus could kind of be either depending upon how crowded the bus was. So Rosa Parks is sitting in kind of that in between section, and a white man wants her seat because the bus starts to fill up, and she refuses to give her seat up to a white man. So that white man then complains to the bus driver, and the bus driver tells Rosa Parks to move, and Rosa Parks says no. And so then the bus driver calls the police, and Rosa Parks is arrested. And this is what sets the stage for her case being appealed and the NAACP getting involved. Now, before we get into what the NAACP did, I just want to highlight something really important. We talked about it when we talked about the Holocaust, but I just want to highlight it again. And that's the idea that just because something is legal does not mean that it's right. Something can be legal and still be morally wrong. And in this case, we see that segregation was legal and it was very morally wrong, even though it was legal. And so just because it was legal doesn't mean it's okay. In fact, there can be things that are legal and very ethically wrong, which is the case with segregation. So, okay, Now let's get to the NAACP. So before Rosa Parks even refused to move out of her seat, back in 1909, the NAACP had been pushing for legal gains. They had been challenging arrests or making appeals or suing or supporting test cases where the goal was to overturn segregation one legal victory at a time. And a major example of a legal victory where the NAACP got involved and civil rights were augmented, they grew, was Norris versus Alabama. And this happened in 1935. And the Supreme Court is going to rule that African Americans can indeed serve on juries. So before 1935, if one was an African American, he or she was not allowed to serve on a jury. And the NAACP saw this as unjust, which it was. And the 14th Amendment allows for equal protection under the law for anyone, regardless of race. And they sue, and the justification is equal protection under the law? Question mark. Like, what happens if you have an African American suspect in an all-white jury in an era where there's a lot of racism going on? Well, the answer is that they're likely not going to get a fair trial. So the 1935 decision in Norris versus Alabama allows for the rights of African Americans to be advanced using constitutional amendments as a justification. And it's a great victory for the civil rights community. Also, in 1942, a group named CORE is established, and they are the Congress of Racial Equality, and they're going to promote protests, most notably sit-ins, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. But a sit-in is really basically you sit somewhere and don't move, and it's an act of protest. Well, I'll explain in more detail tomorrow exactly how that worked and why it's significant, but it's very significant, and it ended up being very effective. All right, I'm going to pause for a second, see if anyone has any questions or comments while I flip my page in my notes here. Check my email, make sure no one else email me. If you have any comments or questions during this stream, please post on the side or send me an email. Okay, let's talk about Brown versus the Board of Education. So we're seeing chronologically victories occurring in the African American community for civil rights, which are great. One of the most iconic victories in the civil rights movement is Brown versus the Board of Education. All right, so what's going on here is we have the separate but equal doctrine being supported because of the 1896 Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, in 1954, Linda Brown is going to sue for equal access. So you have a young African American girl who lives right next to a white school. I mean, a couple hundred yards away. But because of separate but equal doctrine, she has to walk several miles to a blacks only school. And the argument that she's going to make, and that is going to be made on her behalf, is that may be separate, but it is surely not equal. And this case goes to the Supreme Court, and the ruling is that separate but equal is not equal, and that education cannot be segregated anymore. It overturns the idea of segregation in the education field. And this is extremely important because it's a massive victory in the civil rights movement. But there's also going to be a major pushback in the South. There's a ton of resistance in the South. Southern schools do not want to integrate, and integration would be desegregating. They do not want to allow African Americans into what had traditionally been whites-only schools. So what we're going to see is, even though this victory occurs, that doesn't mean that the people's hearts change. So people that had racist views aren't going to just suddenly change their racist views just because the law tells them to. So there's a lot of resistance in the South to desegregation. And while desegregation is being pushed in the schools in the South, this is when Rosa Parks is going on. This is where Rosa Parks is arrested in the same time frame, and where you're going to see that there is going to be court ruling on Rosa Parks' behalf. So Brown versus Board of Education happens 1954. Rosa Parks is arrested in 1955. And then there's a bus boycott done in Montgomery, which is the goal is to bankrupt the busing industry there until they desegregate. And this lasts for close to a year. And the leader of this bus boycott is none other than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But in 1956, the Supreme Court is going to rule that busing segregation is unconstitutional and therefore illegal. That busing companies in the South are no longer allowed to segregate based on race. So this is 1954 is Brown versus Board of Education. 1955, Rosa Parks is arrested. 1956, busing segregation is ruled unconstitutional. But that doesn't mean that the busing companies in the South are going to desegregate. In fact, there's going to be a lot of resistance to busing companies desegregating by white people in the South. And they're not going to fully desegregate until 1962. So that's 6 years after the Supreme Court ruling. Any questions or comments up to this point? Okay. One other thing I want to cover today that's important is the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which is another victory in the civil rights movement. Now, it's not as big of a victory as Brown versus Board of Education. It's not as big of a victory as desegregating the bus lines by a Supreme Court ruling in 1956. But it is symbolically important because I think the reason it's important is that it's going to pave the way for the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. But a couple things that it does, it's going to push for protecting voting rights of African Americans. Remember, the 15th Amendment back in the 1860s, it allows for African Americans to vote, but a lot of southern states make it very difficult for African Americans to vote. So they're technically constitutionally allowed, but they're just unable to due to laws that are racist. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is going to try to protect African Americans' rights to vote, but it's not really going to be very effective in that regard. But it also does something important, is that it creates a civil rights division in the Department of Justice. And this is a big step toward making civil rights a thing, seeing equality being pushed much more by our government, or at least supported governmentally, which is important. Because ultimately it's going to be the federal government, either through the judiciary or through the legislature, that's going to have to push for civil rights to become a thing. Because it starts as a grassroots movement, but it either needs to be supported legally or supported through the Justice Department or through the judiciary branch. So that's why I think the Civil Rights Act of 57 is important. It's a step in the right direction for the government supporting and giving legislature or legislative action behind the civil rights movement. So what I want you to see today is, first, that Norris versus Alabama, 1935, big win in the civil rights community. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, another massive win in the civil rights community. Rosa Parks and her test case, which the ruling is in 1956. Big victory for the civil rights community. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1957 paves the way for other victories in the future. All right, so that's it for today. Keep up the good work that you've all been doing. And I'm just going to pause for a minute to see if there are any final questions or comments. Nope. Okay. Well, if you think of any, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, have a great day, everybody.